Shabbat Shalom. We'll see if anybody can unseat our history champion, Harvey Krieger, from last week. We have two questions this evening. The first is that the temple in Jerusalem in the Bible and we believe in history was destroyed not once, but... Oh, good, look, you all get a point. I'll come to the second question in a moment. There's debate about what happened that it was destroyed twice. This was a major issue theologically for the Jewish people because the temple represented the central power of God. Like we would say, Washington, D.C., not only in what happens in Washington, but also symbolically, Washington, D.C. and all of the buildings, the Capitol, the White House, that they all symbolically represent the central organizing power of our country. So when the central organizing power of your country is destroyed twice, you start to question how powerful that power is. The first time they said, well, it was because the Jewish people were being bad people. They weren't following the commandments. But by the second time, they said, now they've learned their lesson. So what is it that they're doing? They're following the mitzvot. They're not worshiping idols like they did before. And the rabbis told this story, that the reason the second temple was destroyed was because of a man named Bar Kamsa. There was a wealthy man who wanted to have a party, so he said to his servant, please, I want you to go invite this man named Kamsa to my party. Well, the messenger goes out and he ends up inviting Bar Kamsa, which if you translate from the Aramaic means the son of Kamsa. Well, it turns out the son was hated by the person who was throwing the party. So he shows up at the party and the man says, you can't be at my party. He says, well, look, I'm already here. I'll pay you for the food I'm eating. He says, no, you can't be at my party. I despise you. He says, look, I'll pay for half of the entire party. I'm already here. Don't make me leave. He says it again. He offers to pay for the entire party. And still, the man picks him up, moves him, takes him out of the room in front of all of the leaders of the community, all of the rabbis who are famous in the Talmud. And at that point, Bar Kamsa is so angry for having been shamed that he then starts planning little attacks against this man, and it goes back and forth. And eventually they say the temple was destroyed because the Jewish people were fighting amongst themselves so much. Because one person got invited to a party he wasn't supposed to be invited to. So here's your second quiz. 4:30 a.m., April 12th, 1861. Confederate troops fired on Union forces at Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. 34 hours later, the forces known as the Union surrendered. What was it? Well, yeah, you can say it. Yeah, you got it. Right. It's called the beginning of the Civil War. November 6th, 1860, 6 months earlier, there was an election. It brought what was then the new Republican Party to power, electing Abraham Lincoln. He was voted in entirely by representatives from the northern half of the United States. 3 months after that, 3 months before the shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Vice President John Breckinridge presided as the Senate chaplain. This is all on the Senate website, by the way. He shared the following words before the Senate. Hear our petitions and send us an answer of peace, he prayed. May all bitterness and wrath be put away, and may senators deliberate not as partisans, but as brethren and patriots, as we seek the highest welfare of the whole country. Hear us and hear our land. And then the clerk called roll call, and 10 senators walked out. In the month that followed, 25 of the 66 members of the Senate left, supporting the Confederate cause. So, decide whether you were right or not. When was the beginning of the Civil War? Was it when the shot was fired? Or was it when the people started talking to each other and stopped believing in each other and started dividing themselves? History books will tell you that it was when the first shot was fired. But the reality is, civil wars start with a civil war mentality. This was a phrase I heard this week as I was listening to Israeli author and intellectual Yossi Klein Halevi. He said the following, speaking of what he sees today happening in Israel. When we see violence, it is not the beginning, it is the inevitable, practical expression of a mentality of civil war. And what is this mentality? It's when anger turns into rage. It's when opposition turns into hatred. And once you've created that emotional infrastructure for civil war, physical violence follows. If your opponent, your Jewish opponent, is evil and you hate them, and you find yourself in a state of rage and despair, that is a civil war mentality. What we're seeing in Israel today and what we've seen in America, perhaps in the last decade, is a move that comes very close and may even cross the line into a civil war mentality. We see this mentality when we hear about Israeli Air Force reservists walking out of the Israeli Defense Force, refusing to show up for duty. We see it when protesters who live in the same city, pay the same taxes, fight for the same army, are throwing objects at each other across the street. And even in the last 24 hours, it was seen when Prime Minister Netanyahu met with the Prime Minister of England in London amid protesters. Not something that's so unusual, except that the protesters were, of course, Jewish and Israeli, waving the Israeli flag and asking for him to be arrested. My friend and colleague who grew up in the London Jewish community explained to me, it's a sign of civil war mentality when the London Jewish community, far more conservative-minded than the American Jewish community, openly protests the Israeli government. And it says a lot, as he said, when my mom, an Israeli British citizen, who's never taken to the streets to protest anything, feels she has to be there. So we're seeing a civil war mentality. It's among our people, it's in our country. And I think a lot of the questions that I see as we had our panel the other night at the JCC, the number of people who are showing up in larger number than we're accustomed to, the number of questions we're getting, the emails and the articles, we're paying attention because perhaps we don't know what to do as we watch civil war unfold. But this is not the first time that Israel's had to face this mentality. We could probably all remember or are well aware of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Not by a foreign militia, by Israeli citizens who opposed his politics, who hated him for what he stood for as a fellow citizen and leader of their country. And so their hate turned to violence, it turned to assassination. You also may remember the images of the IDF forcibly dismantling Jewish Israeli settlements when Ariel Sharon ordered the unilateral evacuation of Gaza. Israeli soldiers in IDF uniforms with the Jewish star on their shoulder going into settlements mostly inhabited by very visibly Orthodox Jews and physically removing them, putting them into their armored vehicles and driving them back across the Green Line into Israel. But the most obvious example of civil war might be one that you may not be aware of. It happened in the very first month of Israel being a state. It's the story of a ship called the Altalena. In the spring of 1948, there was a Jewish militia called the Irgun. There were lots of Jewish militias prior to the state being created, formed from all sorts of different groups, and they were fighting for the independence of Israel. But once May 14th, 1948, once the state is declared, it is also declared that there will be one Israeli defense force. But this Jewish militia called the Irgun, in that very time that Israel was declared a state, they had already filled a ship and sent it on its way to what was at the time Palestine, but became the state of Israel, filled with more than 900 soldiers and packed with military weapons. The ship, the Altalena, arrived on shore, and even though the IDF had been fighting the War of Independence, and there happened to be at that moment a ceasefire between them and the Arab states, The Irgun was seen to be a force that wanted to plan a coup. It was led by somebody whose name you may recognize, Menachem Begin. He would later become the prime minister of Israel. The IDF, of course, led by Ben-Gurion. The two of them were in negotiations for the Irgun to join the ranks of the IDF, but when the Altalena made landfall in June of 48, it was unclear to those in the IDF if the Irgun was coming to join them or be against them. So for 2 weeks, they fought each other on the shores of Tel Aviv. 16 Irgun fighters, 3 IDF soldiers were killed. In the midst of the fighting, Begin, who was on the ship, flew a white flag of surrender from the ship and insisted that his troops stand down. He later said, "My greatest accomplishment was not retaliating and causing a civil war." Years later, 10 years before he would become prime minister in June of 1967, Menachem Begin, a politician, was asked to go to Ben-Gurion's house to ask him to serve as the prime minister again. Ben-Gurion then said if he had known Begin as he did in the 60s, back in the 40s, the face of Israeli history would be quite different. Two people who became prime ministers, who led the same army just 20 years prior, had their soldiers killing each other on the shores of the very country they would lead. Today, some will say that the laws being put forward to limit the checks and balances in Israel step across a line that we can't accept. Others will say that for too long, the judiciary and other groups in power have ignored or even suppressed the voices of a large number of Israelis, most of whom are not of Ashkenazi descent, most of whom are not white Europeans, most of whom are Orthodox. Two groups, both worried severely for democracy. One who says this hasn't been democratic for a while. One who says you're putting democracy in a coffin by the laws you're trying to pass. Both of them yelling at each other, both of them protesting in the streets at each other, both of them threatening each other. Wherever this started, it's clear it's on a path that leads to a place that we don't want to go. It has too many similarities to the history of the United States in 1860, and perhaps we would say it sounds a lot like the United States in the last few years. All of this makes me wonder whether we should worry that we're on the verge of a civil war, or worry that a civil war has already begun, both in Israel and America alike. Next week, I'll do my best to talk about how civil wars end, having tried to do my best to talk a little bit about how they begin. In the meantime, I pray that this Shabbat we can learn from the wisdom, the end of the story of Ben-Gurion and Begin, two men who led the state of Israel who once fought each other, who had the ability to stop and realize before things got too far that when they came to know each other, when they came to realize that they should be fighting for the same values and not against each other, that they were also brothers in a country and among our people, that they needed to sit down and talk and figure this out. I pray that we'll have the time to have those discussions, that the world will slow, that those who are pushing these ideas will talk to those across the aisle and vice versa, and that we can, in fact, stop this civil war before it becomes anything that is out of our control. Shabbat Shalom.